My wife moved her new boyfriend into our house. She said, "I'm keeping the house in the divorce." I smiled and packed a single small bag. She didn't know the house was owned by my mother. That happened on a Tuesday evening in October, in a house on Sycamore Drive in Raleigh, North Carolina. I had come home from work to find a man I had never met sitting in my living room, drinking a beer from my refrigerator, watching my television. He was 34, good-looking in the assembled way of someone who spent time on it, wearing clothes that said he had paid attention to what they said about him. My wife, Dana, came out of the kitchen. She was 41. We had been married for 9 years. We had been in the process of divorce proceedings for 5 months. She said, "I need to talk to you." I said, "Who is this?" She said, "This is Derek. He is going to be staying here." I said, "Staying here?" She said, "I am keeping the house in the divorce. We both know that. Derek is going to be here while we work through the final paperwork." She said it with the specific flat certainty of someone who had rehearsed the sentence and had decided the rehearsal was sufficient preparation for whatever came next. I looked at Derek. He looked back at me with the specific careful neutrality of a man who understood this was a complicated situation and who had decided the right posture was to let the other people in the room work through it. At least he had that. I looked at the living room, the furniture I had brought from my previous apartment when Dana and I moved in together in 2015. The rug Dana had picked out in 2017 that I had never liked, but that I had said was fine when she asked, because she seemed to care about it more than I did. The photographs on the wall. The coffee table with a ring stain on it from a party we had thrown in 2019 that I had said I would fix and that I never fixed. I looked at Dana. I said, "Okay." I went upstairs. I took a small bag from the closet, the kind you took on a 2-night business trip. I packed what I needed. I came back downstairs. I said, "I am going to stay at my mother's for a while." Dana said, "Robert, we still need to finalize the house arrangement in the settlement." I said, "I know. My attorney will be in touch." She said, "Robert, I want to be clear that I am keeping this house. That is not negotiable." I said, "I understand your position." I walked to the front door. I opened it. I said, "Enjoy the evening." I drove to my mother's house on Whitfield Street. My mother, Evelyn Caldwell, was 69 years old. She was at the kitchen table doing a crossword puzzle when I came in. She looked at my bag. She said, "What happened?" I told her. She said she moved him in. I said, "Yes." She said, "While the divorce is still ongoing." I said, "Yes." She said, "And she told you she is keeping the house." I said, her exact words were, "It is not negotiable." My mother put down her crossword puzzle pen. She said, "Robert, you know I own that house." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I do not believe Dana knows that." I said, "I do not believe she does either." My mother picked up her pen. She looked at her crossword. She said, "I am going to call Patricia in the morning." Patricia was Patricia Webb, my mother's attorney, the woman who had handled every legal matter in my mother's life for 22 years, including the purchase of the house on Sycamore Drive, which my mother had bought in her name in 2014 as an investment property, and which she had rented to me at a below-market rate when Dana and I moved in the following year. I said, "I think that is the right call." She said, "Do you want tea?" I said, "Yes, please." She made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. She went back to her crossword. I thought about Dana in the house on Sycamore Drive, explaining to Derek how the next phase of her life was going to look. I thought about the specific quality of someone being absolutely certain about something that was not true. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you are new here. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Every week a new story. Let us go back to where all of this actually started. My name is Robert Caldwell, and I am 47 years old. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, the only child of Evelyn and Winston Caldwell. My father, Winston, ran a small commercial cleaning company called Caldwell Cleaning Services from 1978 until he sold it in 2009. He started it with one industrial floor polisher and one contract to clean 2 office suites in a building on Hillsborough Street. He built it to 14 regular commercial clients and 6 employees over 30 years. The building was not built quickly, and it was not built from anything except showing up every day and doing the job correctly. He was a quiet man in the specific way of someone who had decided early that quiet was more effective than loud. He did not give speeches. He did not have principles he announced. He had practices he maintained. He was at the job by 5 in the morning and he was in bed by 9 at night. And between those 2 times, he did the work and he was honest about the work, and he was honest with the people who paid him for it. When he sold the business in 2009, the buyer was a commercial cleaning franchise that had been trying to buy it for 3 years. Winston had turned them down twice because the price was not right. The third offer was right and he took it. He said to me when the sale closed, "I sold it at the right time for the right price to the right buyer. 3 rights is not always available. When it is, you take it." He passed away in 2013 from a cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. He left my mother comfortable, not wealthy in the financial portfolio sense, comfortable in the specific sense of a woman who owned her home outright and had savings that were sufficient to sustain her life without working, and who did not need anything from anyone. My mother, Evelyn, had been a librarian at a Raleigh public library for 33 years. She retired in 2018. She was the most organized person I had ever known. She had the specific kind of intelligence that found homes for things, information, objects, money, relationships. She knew where everything was. She knew what everything meant in relation to what else. She did not lose things, and she did not misplace things, and she did not forget things. She also had the quality of being entirely impossible to fool. Not because she was suspicious, because she paid attention. The specific full attention that librarians developed from 30 years of helping people find what they were actually looking for, which required understanding what they were actually looking for beneath what they said they were looking for. I was an only child. I received from both of them the qualities they each had. From my father, the patience and the preference for practice over principle. From my mother, the attention and the specific inability to let things go unfiled. I went to NC State for mechanical engineering. I graduated in 1999. I went to work at a manufacturing firm in the Research Triangle Park area that designed and built precision industrial components. I was not a dramatic engineer. I was the specific, useful kind who understood what things needed to do and designed them to do exactly that without excess. I moved up through the company steadily. Lead engineer by 2005, senior project manager by 2009, director of product development by 2014. I was good at my job in the way that produced consistent results over a long career, rather than in the way that produced spectacular moments. I want to tell you about the house on Sycamore Drive, because the house is the center of the story, and you need to understand what it was. In 2013, after my father died, my mother decided to do something with a portion of the inheritance. Not invest in the market. She was not a market person. She was a property person. She had watched property in Raleigh over 30 years, and she understood it with the specific direct knowledge of someone who had been watching it in one city her entire adult life. She bought the house on Sycamore Drive in October of 2014. She bought it in her name, Evelyn Rose Caldwell. The deed said Evelyn Rose Caldwell. The mortgage, which she paid off in 4 years because she structured it to do that, was in Evelyn Rose Caldwell's name. The property tax records said Evelyn Rose Caldwell. Everything about the house said Evelyn Rose Caldwell. She bought it as a rental investment. She offered it to me first, as a family arrangement, at a rent that was below market because the rent was income to her, and because the below-market arrangement was her choice and it benefited us both. Dana and I moved in 2015. Dana did not ask whose name was on the deed. I did not volunteer the information. This was not a deliberate concealment. It simply never came up. Dana handled the relationship with the house as a tenant handles a relationship with their home. She lived in it. She made it hers. She painted the dining room. She replaced the kitchen faucets. She bought the rug I never liked. She did not ask because she assumed. The assumption was natural given that we were a married couple moving into a house, and that I was the one who arranged the housing, and that I was the one whose family history was in Raleigh, and therefore the most plausible person to have a housing connection. She assumed the house was in my name. She was wrong. I discovered the full extent of what Dana had built toward the divorce when she told me, in May of the year the divorce proceedings started, that she believed the house was the primary marital asset and that she expected to retain it in the settlement. I did not correct her at that moment. Not as strategy. I was processing everything that the divorce was, and I was not thinking clearly about the house in that first conversation. I thought I would get to it. I got to it the following week. I called my mother. I said, Dana is under the impression that the house on Sycamore is marital property. My mother was quiet for a moment. She said, has she seen the deed? I said, apparently not. She said, has your attorney reviewed the deed? I said, I am calling my attorney today. She said, Robert, I own that house. Your name has never been on the deed. You have been a tenant. The rent payments have been documented as such for 9 years. There is no basis in North Carolina law for a spouse to claim rights to property owned by a third party just because the couple lived there as tenants. I said, I know that. She said, does Dana's attorney know that? I said, I am going to find out. My attorney, a woman named Christine Marks who had been doing family law in Raleigh for 18 years, and who had the specific comprehensive knowledge of North Carolina property law that this situation required, reviewed everything within 48 hours. She called me. She said, Robert, the house is not marital property. It was never marital property. Your mother owns it. You have documentation of 9 years of rent payments to your mother as landlord. The property tax records and deed are entirely clear. Dana's claim to the house has no legal foundation. I said, what happens when Dana's attorney figures this out? She said, at some point in the discovery process, the deed will surface. That conversation is going to be interesting for Dana's attorney. I said, when does discovery typically reach property assets? She said, it depends on how quickly they move. They will eventually request a comprehensive property inventory. I said, and until then? She said, until then you do not have an obligation to volunteer information that the other party has not requested. We respond honestly to everything that is properly requested. We do not proactively disclose. I said, I understand. She said, Robert, I want to ask you something. I said, ask. She said, is there any chance Dana does know about the ownership structure and is misrepresenting her understanding? I said, no, Dana does not know. She would have raised it differently if she knew. This is genuine assumption, not strategy. She said, that makes this simpler. When it surfaces, it surfaces. It surfaced on a Tuesday evening in October when I came home and found Derek on my couch, and Dana told me the house was hers, and I smiled and packed a bag. Subscribe right now and stay with me. My mother called Patricia Webb at 8:30 on Wednesday morning. Patricia Webb had been my mother's attorney since 2002. She was 62, a property and estate law specialist who had handled my mother's affairs since before my father died, and who knew the Sycamore Drive property as well as she knew any asset she had documented. My mother said, "Patricia, Robert's wife believes she is going to receive the house on Sycamore Drive in the divorce settlement." Patricia said, "I see." My mother said, "She has moved another man into the property." Patricia said, "While the divorce is ongoing." My mother said, "Yes." Patricia said, "Evelyn, let me review the tenant agreement and I will call you back by noon." She called back at 11:15. She said, "Evelyn, the rental arrangement with Robert has been month to month since January of this year following the expiration of the annual term. Standard notice provisions apply." My mother said, 30 days. Patricia said, 30 days. My mother said, "And the property has an unauthorized occupant." Patricia said, "The tenant agreement covers Robert Caldwell. It does not extend to any additional occupants who have not been approved by the landlord." My mother said, "What do you recommend?" Patricia said, "I can send a formal notice to the property today. The notice will accomplish two things. First, it will inform the occupant that the property is owned by Evelyn Rose Caldwell and that any claim to the property in Robert's divorce proceedings has no basis in law. Second, it will initiate the 30-day notice period and request the removal of the unauthorized occupant." My mother said, "Please send it." Patricia said, "Evelyn, I want to make sure you understand the full scope of this. When this notice arrives, Dana's attorney is going to have an emergency situation on their hands. The entire basis of Dana's property claim in the divorce is going to evaporate." My mother said, "I understand." Patricia said, "Are you comfortable with that outcome?" My mother said, "Patricia, I own that house. I have owned it for 10 years. I maintained it and paid the property taxes and covered the insurance, and I rented it to my son at a fair family rate. His wife has moved another man into my house and told my son she is keeping it. Yes, I am comfortable with the outcome." Patricia said, "I will have the notice sent by 3 o'clock." My mother said, "Thank you." She called me after she finished with Patricia. She said, "The notice goes out today." I said, "What is in it?" She told me. I said, "How do you think Dana is going to respond?" She said, "I imagine she is going to call her attorney, and her attorney is going to have a very difficult conversation with her." I said, "And Derek?" She said, "Derek is an unauthorized occupant in a property owned by Evelyn Rose Caldwell. He is going to be asked to leave." She said it with the specific quiet of someone who was entirely clear about what they were doing and entirely comfortable with the clarity. I said, "Mom." She said, "Yes." I said, "You did not have to do this today. You could have waited for the discovery process to surface it." She said, "Robert, a man I have never met is drinking beer in my living room." She said it simply. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Come for dinner." I came for dinner. She made the specific meal she made when something significant had happened, and when the cooking was the way she processed the significance. Pot roast with the specific seasoning combination I had grown up with. Cornbread, sweet tea. We ate and she told me about her day, and I told her about my day, and neither of us talked about the notice that was being delivered to Sycamore Drive until we were done eating and the plates were cleared. Then she said, "How are you actually?" I said, "I am tired." She said, "The marriage or the divorce?" I said, "Both." She said, "When did you know?" I said, "Know what?" She said that it was not going to work. I sat with this. I said, "Probably 2020. We had been struggling before that. But 2020 was when I understood it was not going to resolve." She said, "Why didn't you say something?" I said, "Because saying it made it true." She said, "It was already true." I said, "I know." She said, "Your father and I had hard years. Everyone does." I said, "I know." She said, The difference between hard years and finished is whether both people are still trying. I said, Dana stopped trying a while before she let me know she had stopped. She said, yes. She said, and Derek. I said, I do not know how long that has been going on. I chose not to find out specifically because it would not have changed the outcome and it would have made the processing of the outcome harder. She said, that is wise. I said, or cowardly. She said, those are not always different things. Sometimes the wise path and the path away from pain are the same path. I said, is this the time you tell me something my father said? She said, your father said that when you could not fix something, you should at least make sure it was done clearly. A clean ending was the most respectful thing you could give a situation that was not going to continue. I said, the house is a clean ending. She said, the house is what it always was, my property. I am simply making sure everyone knows what it always was. She cleared the dishes. She brought back the crossword she had been working on the night before. She said, what is a 7-letter word for something handed down? I said, bequest. She wrote it in. She said, good night. Robert. I said, good night, Mom. The notice arrived at Sycamore Drive at 4:17 that afternoon. Dana's attorney received a copy at the same time. I know the timeline because Christine Marks told me the following morning that Dana's attorney had called her at 4:52, in a state that Christine described as professionally controlled and internally not controlled at all. Subscribe right now and stay with me. Dana called me at 7:45 that evening. I was at my mother's kitchen table. I answered. She said, Robert. I said, Dana. She said, I received a legal notice today from an attorney representing Evelyn Caldwell. I said, yes. She said, it says that Evelyn Caldwell owns the house on Sycamore Drive. I said, yes. She said, Robert, what is happening? I said, my mother owns the house on Sycamore Drive. She has owned it since 2014. I have been renting it from her since 2015. That is the full picture. Silence. She said, you have been renting it. I said, yes. She said, your mother's name is on the deed. I said, yes. She said, not yours. I said, no. She said, why didn't you tell me? I said, in 2015 when we moved in, you did not ask. It did not come up. I did not think to raise it as a formal disclosure because you were moving into a home and the mechanics of whose name was on what document seemed secondary to the fact that we were starting our life there. She said, and when I told you in May that I was going to keep the house. I said, I understood at that point that there was a misunderstanding. I spoke to my attorney and she confirmed that the house is my mother's property and not marital property, and that the appropriate process was to let the discovery portion of the divorce proceedings surface the deed. She said, so you knew and you let me keep planning around a house you knew I could not have. I said, Dana, I did not let you plan around anything. I knew the legal reality. I did not have an obligation to correct your assumption before the legal process addressed it. The notice today is part of the legal process addressing it. She said, this is not fair. I said, I want to ask you something. She said, what? I said, was it fair to move Derek into a house while divorce proceedings were ongoing without notifying me or my attorney? Silence. She said, that is different. I said, it is related. She said, Robert, I have been planning around keeping that house. I made decisions about the settlement based on that house being available to me. I said, what decisions? She said, I agreed to certain terms on the retirement accounts because I thought the house offset them. I said, that is something to discuss with your attorney. She said, my attorney is going to be furious. I said, I imagine the conversation will be difficult. She said, were you planning this? I said, I was aware of the legal reality. I was not aware of the timing of when it would surface. My mother made the decision to send the notice after you moved Derek into her property. She said his being there was inappropriate. I know that. She said it with the specific tired honesty of someone who had already known something was inappropriate and who had done it anyway, and who was now watching the cost of having done it. I said, Dana. She said, what? I said, I do not want this to be worse than it has to be. We have been married for 9 years. Some of those years were good. I want us to get through this in a way that is as clean and fair as possible. She said, you should have told me about the house. I said, possibly, but the place we are in right now was not caused by the house. She was quiet. She said, no, it was not. I said, let your attorney talk to Christine. They will figure out a fair path forward on the settlement. The house issue being resolved actually simplifies things. There is one less thing to negotiate. She said, there is one less thing for me. I said, yes. She said, Robert. I said, yes. She said, I am sorry. She said it the way people said things when they meant them, but also knew the meaning was not sufficient. I said, I know. She said, about all of it, not just the house. I said, I know that too. She said, is there anything? I said, no, but thank you for saying it. She hung up. I sat at the kitchen table. My mother came from the living room. She said she called. I said, yes. She said, how did it go? I said, better than I expected at the end. She said she apologized. I said, yes. My mother sat down across from me. She said, your father always said that people were capable of better than their worst moments if the conditions for better became available. I said, what are the conditions? She said, being out of options mostly. I said, that is less flattering than I expected. She said, it is honest though. I said, yes it is. She went back to her book. I went to the guest room. I slept better than I had in months. The settlement took 3 more months to finalize. The house was removed from the contested assets immediately. Dana's attorney managed the situation with the professional competence that being forced to manage a significant surprise required. She renegotiated the retirement account terms that Dana had agreed to in exchange for a house she could not have. The final settlement was more equitable than what Dana had originally proposed specifically, because the house had been removed, and the negotiation reset around what was actually available to divide. Derek moved out of Sycamore Drive within the 30-day notice period. He moved into Dana's new apartment in Midtown Raleigh. I do not know what became of that relationship, because it was not information that belonged to me. I moved back into Sycamore Drive in January after the settlement was finalized. My mother renewed the lease. She kept the rent the same. Subscribe right now and stay with me, because the final 2 sections are the part that is actually about what all of this meant. I want to tell you about my mother's relationship with property, because it is the part of this story that most people miss when they hear the headline version. My mother did not buy the house on Sycamore Drive to protect me in a divorce. She bought it in 2014 because she had watched the Raleigh property market for 30 years from the specific vantage point of someone who lived in the city and who understood what the city was becoming. Research Triangle Park had been drawing technology and pharmaceutical companies since the 1970s, and the residential demand that came with that growth was transforming neighborhoods in specific ways that my mother understood clearly. Sycamore Drive was in a neighborhood that was transitioning from the specific older working-class character of mid-century Raleigh to the newer professional character of a city absorbing tech industry growth. The house needed work when she bought it. She bought it knowing it needed work. She supervised the renovation personally, making every decision about what to fix and how to fix it with the specific careful attention she brought to everything. She rented it to me at a family rate because the arrangement made sense for both of us. She had a reliable tenant who would maintain the property carefully. I had stable housing at a reasonable cost while I was in the early phase of my career's highest earning period. It was a sensible family arrangement. The fact that it became protective in the divorce was the result of how things unfolded, not the original design. I want to tell you this because the dramatic version of the story, the one where the wise mother secretly set up the protection years in advance, is satisfying but not accurate. The accurate version is more ordinary and in some ways more interesting. My mother made a sensible property investment. She documented it correctly. She maintained the arrangement properly. When the situation arose where the property's ownership structure mattered, it mattered in a very clear way because everything about it had always been exactly what it was supposed to be. That is the lesson that is easy to miss in the headline. The protection was not created by anticipating the specific situation. The protection was created by doing everything correctly from the beginning. Clear title, clear lease, clear documentation of 9 years of rent payments, clear records showing that Evelyn Rose Caldwell owned the property and that Robert Caldwell was her tenant. No ambiguity, no gaps, no informal arrangement that would have created the specific vulnerability that an informal arrangement created. My father built his cleaning company the same way. He did not anticipate every specific situation that would arise over 30 years. He built a company that was what it said it was, properly licensed, properly insured, properly contracted, clients clearly documented, work clearly described. When situations arose, and they did over 30 years. Situations always arose. The response was always simple because the foundation was always clear. My mother learned this from watching him do it for 40 years. I learned it from watching both of them. The house on Sycamore Drive was the expression of that learning at the specific moment when it mattered most. My mother called me in February, 6 weeks after I moved back in. She said, "How is the house?" I said, "It is good. I fixed the kitchen faucet that has been dripping since 2019. She said, "I noticed that when I came by in November." I said, "You noticed it and did not say anything." She said, "I decided to see how long it would take you to address it." I said, 3 years. She said, "I know." She said, "Robert." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you genuinely okay? Not the version you tell people, the real version." I said, "The real version is that I am better than I was in October and not yet fully back to where I was before all of this started, which is probably normal for 9 months into ending a 9-year marriage." She said, "Yes, that is normal." She said, "Your father was 63 when he sold the business. He had been building it since he was 34. When it was gone, he did not know what to do with himself for about 8 months." I said, "I did not know that." She said, "He did not talk about it, but I watched it. He would get up in the morning at his normal time and then he would sit in the kitchen because there was no job to go to and he did not know how to organize a day around something other than the job." She said, "After about 8 months, he started going to the library." I said, "Your library?" She said, "My library. He would come in the mornings when it opened and he would read for 2 or 3 hours and then he would go home and do things around the house." She said, "He read everything. History, biography, how-to books about carpentry and plumbing. He fixed everything in the house that had needed fixing for 20 years because he finally had the time." I said, "I did not know he came to your library." She said, "Almost every day for 3 years." I said, "You never told me." She said, "There are things in a marriage that belong to the marriage. He was not going to tell you because it was his private way of adjusting to something. I was not going to tell you because it was the same." I said, "I understand." She said, The point is that it took him 8 months to figure out what the next version of his day looked like. You have been in the process of this for 9 months. You are in about the right place for where you are in the process. I said, how did he figure it out, the next version? She said, he decided that what he had been doing for 30 years was taking care of things. The company was the thing he had been taking care of. When it was gone, he needed another thing to take care of. She said the library came first, then the house, then me. I said, he was always taking care of you. She said, differently after, with more intention, more time for it. I said, that is a good story. She said, it is a true story. She said, good night, Robert. I said, good night, Mom. She said, the faucet under the bathroom sink has been dripping for 2 months. I said, I will look at it this weekend. She said, I know. Spring came to Raleigh in the specific way it came every year. The dogwoods on Whitfield Street first, then the Japanese maples, then everything else in a rush of color that lasted about 3 weeks and that I had been watching my entire life, and that still surprised me every year by arriving before I was ready for it. I was in the Sycamore Drive house, with a new clarity that the house had never had before. Not because anything had changed about the house, because my relationship to it had changed. For 9 years it had been the shared space of a marriage. For 5 months it had been the disputed space of a divorce. Now it was simply mine in the specific way of something that had been what it always was, and that I was finally able to see clearly. My mother's name was on the deed. Mine was not. That was going to continue. We had a conversation about it in March. I said, Mom, I want to talk about eventually buying the house from you. She said, I have been thinking about that. I said, what have you been thinking? She said, I have been thinking about what the right structure is, whether a direct sale is the right answer or whether there is a different arrangement that makes more sense for both of us. She said, I want you to talk to Patricia and Christine together. Get them in the same room. I want whatever we do to be documented as clearly as everything else about this house has been documented. I said, yes. She said, Robert, I want to tell you something about the house. I said, tell me. She said, I bought it because I wanted you to have a good place to live in Raleigh when you were ready to be in a real home rather than an apartment. That was the whole reason. I said, not as an investment. She said it was an investment, but the investment was in you. The financial return was secondary. I said, I did not know that at the time. She said, you would have argued with me about it. She was right, I would have argued with her about it. She said, when you and Dana moved in, I hoped the house would be a good home for both of you. It was for a while. I said, yes, it was. She said, when it stopped being good for both of you, it was still mine. And when someone tried to take it on a basis that was never legally valid, it became important to make that clear. I said, you could have made it clear earlier, in May when the divorce started. She said, I could have. I chose not to because I wanted to see how the process developed. I wanted to understand what Dana's actual claim was before I responded to it. She said, when she moved Derek into the house, I understood the claim well enough to respond. I said, that was the line for you. She said, that was the specific moment when I understood that waiting was no longer the right approach. She said, a man I had never met was in my house. Your wife had told you she was keeping my house. The time for waiting was done. I said, yes. She said, I called Patricia the next morning. I said, I know. She said, and Patricia sent the notice. I said, yes. She said, and here we are. She looked around the kitchen. She said, it is a good house, Robert. I said, yes, it is. She said, your father would have appreciated the bones of it. I said, what do you mean? She said, he liked houses that were built right. He used to look at older houses and say you could tell when a builder understood what they were doing because the house held up over time without the issues that came from shortcuts in the construction. She said this house was built right, 1963, good bones. I said, I keep finding things about it that someone thought about properly when they built it. She said, that is what good bones means. She looked at her coffee cup. She said, build things right, Robert. Whatever comes next, build it right. I said, I know, Mom. She said, your father said it every time he started a new contract. Every time. Build it right or do not build it at all. I said, I have heard that my whole life. She said, and? I said, and I have tried to live by it. She said, the house is still standing. I said, yes, it is. She said, that is not an accident. I sat with that. She was right. The house on Sycamore Drive was standing because my mother had bought it correctly, titled it correctly, documented it correctly, maintained it correctly, and rented it correctly for 10 years. When someone tried to claim it on a basis that was not valid, it could not be claimed because there was nothing unclear to exploit. Everything had always been exactly what it said it was. Dana had assumed and assumed and assumed. Assumption was not a legal instrument. The deed was. Patricia Webb contacted my attorney Christine Marks in April about the structure for an eventual ownership transfer. The two attorneys spent 6 weeks working through the options. They came back with a recommendation. I bought the house from my mother in June. Fair market value, documented properly, mortgage in my name, deed in my name. Clean. My mother received the proceeds. She called me when the wire transferred. She said, it feels strange to have that money instead of the house. I said, what are you going to do with it? She said, I am going to let Patricia and my financial advisor figure out where it should live. She said, and then I am going to stop thinking about it. I said, you're going to stop thinking about $60-something thousand. She said, I am not going to keep checking on it. When you have your money in the right place, you do not need to keep checking on it. I said, you are remarkable. She said, I am practical. I said, those are the same thing in your case. She said, come for dinner Sunday. I said, I will be there. I hung up. I was in the kitchen on Sycamore Drive. The deed was in my name. The title was clear. The faucet under the bathroom sink had been fixed in March. The drip in the kitchen was fixed the same week. Outside, the Raleigh spring was doing what it did, moving forward without waiting to be noticed. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I thought about a woman who had bought a house in 2014 and titled it correctly and maintained it and documented everything and who had waited until the right moment to make the clarity visible. I thought about a man who had built a cleaning company from one floor polisher and one contract, and who had sold it at the right time for the right price to the right buyer. I thought about the specific inheritance they had both given me, not the house, not the money, not the property. The understanding that what you build lasts exactly as long as you build it correctly. No longer. No shorter. Here is what I want you to hold from this story. The house on Sycamore Drive was protected because my mother bought it correctly in 2014. She did not buy it correctly because she was anticipating a divorce in 2023. She bought it correctly because she bought everything correctly, because she had watched my father build a company correctly for 30 years and had absorbed what correctly meant from that watching. The protection arrived when it was needed because the foundation was always right. Dana could not claim the house because there was nothing to claim. A clearly titled property owned by a third party with 9 years of documented rental payments is not a marital asset in North Carolina or most anywhere else. The situation was not complicated. It was simple. It was simple because everything about it was clear. That is the whole lesson. Not the headline. Not that she didn't know the house was owned by my mother moment. The lesson is what produced that moment. Years of doing things correctly, titling things correctly, documenting things correctly, maintaining things correctly, being exactly what you said you were in every document and every arrangement. When someone tried to claim something on an incorrect basis, the incorrectness of their basis was immediately visible because there was nothing unclear about the foundation. Dana assumed. Assumption was not sufficient. The thing I want you to hear if you are building something right now, a business, a property portfolio, a career, a family structure, anything, build it in a way that does not depend on assumption. Document the things that matter. Title things correctly. Be exactly what you say you are in the record. Because the day will come when the record is the thing that matters. Make the record clean. Drop a comment and tell me something real. Tell me about the assumption someone made about something you had built that turned out to be wrong. Tell me what happened when the reality surfaced. Tell me where you are watching from. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. New story every single week and everyone earns your time. Thank you for being here.